We're nowhere close to Halloween at time of recording, but I thought this tone might be appropriate. After all, these are some very scary times we're living through. I am, of course, referring to COVID-19, the pandemic that many have called the worst public health crisis of the 21st century. These days, I, like many of you, have been relegated to my humble apartment where, alone, I have often resorted to video games to pass the time. And there's one game in particular that I just can't stop thinking about. And that's what I want to talk about today. Today, I want to talk about Arknights and pandemic horror.
Arknights is a Chinese tower defense game set in a post-apocalyptic dystopia. As the story goes, there's a deadly, incurable disease called auropathy that's spread in the aftermath of huge natural disasters called catastrophes. In the wake of this disease, some countries have enacted strict quarantine measures designed to isolate the infected from the rest of the population. I say quarantine, but in some places, the infected are corralled into impoverished slums and even carted off to forced labor camps in far-flung regions. It's honestly very heavy stuff. I don't think I've ever played a mobile game that deals with these kinds of themes so directly.
You know, Russell, now that I'm walking into the quarantine zone, it just hit me. I don't know anything about the quarantine zone.
Well, actually, the word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni, which means 40 days, the period that all ships were required to be isolated before crew could go ashore during the Black Death.
All right. Cool.
Quarantines are usually put in place to prevent diseases from spreading. If you isolate the people you think have a disease, then there's nowhere for the disease to spread to, and eventually it will die off. That's the hope, at least. Arknights doesn't do this. Auropathy isn't very contagious. In fact, it isn't very clear it's even possible to transmit it from one living person to another. It's actually spread by a mineral called originium. This is weird, and that isn't lost on the players. One of my friends who plays the game actually criticized the story because he thought the quarantines made no sense. And yeah, looking at auropathy as just a medical condition, the quarantines don't make any sense. But we're not here to talk about medical conditions. Chubby Emu's got that genre handled. We're here to, as my high school English teacher used to say, think deeper. If they're not trying to contain auropathy, then what are the quarantines for? Well, maybe it's less about the disease, and more about the infected. HIV, or human immunodeficiency virus, is the real-life virus that causes AIDS, a severe disease that reduces the body's ability to fight other diseases. Like auropathy, it's actually not a very contagious disease. It's mostly spread through blood-to-blood transmission. And while it usually can't be cured, these days treatment options allow patients to live fairly long and relatively normal lives, at least in certain regions. However, for decades, in the US especially, HIV and AIDS were largely ignored. This wasn't accidental either. People knew HIV/AIDS existed, but it wasn't considered a problem, because many of them believed it was a gay man's disease. Public perception was that only homosexuals could get AIDS, and many people held deeply homophobic beliefs that made them view the suffering of gays as somehow less important, with some even going so far as to say that AIDS was divine punishment. The homophobic stigma around HIV/AIDS led to thousands of needless deaths and a worsening crisis. And this crisis isn't over either. Legislation for HIV/AIDS relief and funds for programs like needle exchanges are still controversial issues in many areas. The fictional oropathy and the real-life HIV are both examples of what medical writers have called stigmatized illness. The idea that sometimes the way a disease is perceived socially can actually worsen its effects is an expanding field of study. Psychiatrist Norman Sartorius, for instance, has discussed mental disorders as a target of stigma, explaining how even family members can be socially disadvantaged due to someone's mental illness. And an article from Emory University's School of Nursing concludes that fear and stigma can severely impede pandemic response, citing various influenza pandemics around the world. Stigma itself is a complicated term, with a long history dating back to the ancient Greek word for a mark made by a brand. The American sociologist Irving Goffman described stigma as a kind of relationship between an attribute and how that attribute is perceived. The stigma around HIV we mentioned earlier, for instance, is an example of the disparity between the actual disease and its social effects. Goffman was an influential figure, but he had his problems. Among them was that he was very reluctant to connect his writings on stigma to politics and race, a matter that was quite pressing in the 1960s when he was writing. He framed stigma against normal people, and sometimes shaded into some questionable territory that made room for excusing racism. Goffman's studies of social interaction laid the groundwork for an understanding of stigma, but it was black sociologists who later explained stigma not just in the abstract, but as a struggle. Instead of talking about stigma as normal versus abnormal, it's more useful to talk about stigma in relation to the power structures it enforces. Goffman wrote a lot about managing stigma, but later writers have emphasized the importance of resisting it. There's a question that was relevant in the 1960s when Goffman was writing, and it's still relevant today. How do we move past stigma? Arknights, as it turns out, is a story that is chock full of discussion about stigma. Within its story are questions of racial and class identity, repression, and resistance. And so today, I'm interested in taking a look at what Arknights has to say about stigmatization, where it goes right, and where I think it goes a little wrong. And to understand Arknights, you first need to understand monsters. You can learn a lot about a culture from the stories they tell. And one particular kind of story that almost all cultures have is a monster story.
Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Monsters are much more than just scary creatures. They reflect the societies that spawn them. The word monster itself comes from the Latin word monstrum, which means that which reveals. Monsters are horrifying, but they're horror with a purpose. The blood-sucking vampires of Europe were very intentionally designed as ruthless aristocrats, and the zombies of Haitian folklore are morbid reflections of the African slaves that were brought to the region by Europeans to work the plantations. With this in mind, I want to first talk about the Black Death and the Grim Reaper. The Black Death was a pandemic that shook 14th century Europe to its core. It peaked between 1346 and 1353, and by its end had killed over half of Europe's population by some estimates. The impact of this pandemic is immeasurable, and it's commonly believed to be the moment that feudalism began to collapse. The COVID-19 pandemic has often been described as uncertain times, but even more so, the Black Death really was a time of great uncertainty. Entire villages vanished as if swept away by the wind, family and lovers snatched away in the night by some invisible force. And from this uncertainty and fear emerged the figure of the Grim Reaper. The Grim Reaper is a monster that encompasses the fears and realities of the Black Death. An invisible, all-powerful being, the Reaper isn't malevolent. It just reaps. To the Reaper, human lives are just crops to be harvested. It's a pessimistic monster that reflects people's newfound intimacy with their own mortality. The Reaper will come for us all. And this intimacy with death is also reflected in how the Reaper is depicted. It's a giant skeleton, a corpse. Before the Black Death, people rarely had chances to witness the decay of a human body. But with the sheer amount of death at the hand of the plague, corpses became a regular sight on the streets of Europe, a morbid reminder of how we'll all look one day. So why am I telling you this? Well, the Grim Reaper is the first example that I can find of a pandemic becoming monstrous. And the depiction of disease as a monster is a theme that Arknights shares with both the Grim Reaper and other more contemporary figures. Arknights is pretty direct with its references to monstrosity. The few times that protagonists do interact with civilians, they're met with fear. And there's even this scene where a rioter directly calls our infected heroine, Amia, a monster. People don't just fear the infected because they're scared of catching a disease. They fear the infected because that disease itself has conferred this status that differentiates the infected as the monstrous other. The rioters were actively hunting infected children in the slums. It's a genuinely disturbing thing to think about, and it connects on a deeper level with how infection and otherness is often portrayed in monster stories. And there's one story in particular that pioneered monstrous otherness. For this project, I read Bram Stoker's seminal monster story, Dracula. The influence of Dracula is so powerful that it's basically defined how vampires are depicted to this very day, from Sesame Street's Count Von Count to Helsing's Alucard. Reading the book, there's so many ways that it could be interpreted that to even scratch the surface, I'd need at least 2 more videos. That said, today the focus is on how Dracula can help us understand stigmatization. Because while Dracula is noble and powerful, he's also a creature that is cursed to forever lack familiarity. There's this moment early on in Dracula that I was really surprised by. It's when Dracula is first getting to know one of our narrators, Jonathan Harker. We're not introduced to Count Dracula as a bloodthirsty vampire, but as a foreign nobleman, captivated by England, and yet possessing a profound anxiety about his own otherness. Well, I know that did I move and speak in your London, none there are who would not know me for a stranger. That is not enough for me. Here I am noble, I am boyar, the common people know me, and I am master. But a stranger in a strange land, he is no one. Men know him not, and to know not is to care not for. I am content if I am like the rest, so that no man stops if he sees me, or pause in his speaking if he hear my words. Ha ha, a stranger. It's possible to read the entire book as being about this fear of becoming othered, about vampirism as a stigmatized illness. Later on in the book, when Dracula's true nature is revealed, Professor Abraham Van Helsing becomes the vampire hunter who seeks to destroy Dracula and his kin. Van Helsing is not a vigilante or a hero. He is specifically framed as a hunter. The matter of if Dracula himself is evil isn't really a question for Van Helsing, and there's a whole philosophical debate over whether Dracula can really be called evil in the first place. As far as Van Helsing is concerned, vampires are just existences that are unholy and dangerous, and thus they must be destroyed. It's also fascinating how you can see the historical moment that Stoker lived in reflected in his writing. Stoker lived in Britain, and a lot of Dracula is about the anxiety of a declining British Empire, the fear of reverse colonization. In a way, the vampire is the figure of the racial other, the foreign invader, threatening to destroy the empire from within, turning the civilized British people into savage monsters. This post-colonial reading of Dracula has been compared to the psychoanalyst Carl Jung's concept of the shadow, which is the dark, instinctive side of the unconscious that supposedly lurks within everyone's mind. Dracula is the shadow of the British Empire that they must acknowledge, at least that's how the analogy goes. And while I can see where this explanation is coming from, I'm also kind of skeptical of these kinds of distinctions. After all, the historical anxieties that Dracula is based on didn't come from some archetypal conflict between good and evil, but from the material relations of colonialism. My criticism of this Jungian reading of Dracula is heavily based on the works of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. The two were heavily critical of how psychoanalysts like Jung viewed the unconscious as unchanging and universal, and they called for an understanding of the unconscious through the effects of social conditions. They called this view schizoanalysis, in contrast to the psychoanalysis that Jung contributed to. To be clear, I'm generalizing these concepts very heavily. Anyone who's studied Deleuze and Guattari is probably shouting at me right about now. But the key takeaway is how the unconscious doesn't just exist. It's informed by various social relations. Thinking back to Arknights, the rioters who chased down the infected children in the slums were themselves monster hunters. The infected aren't being hunted because they've committed a specific crime, but because the very fact of their existence is perceived as a threat. And in reflecting on the justifications of these monster hunters, the social relations that led to this stigma, and how the infected react to their stigma, we first have to understand the antagonists of the game. In response to the persecution and violence the infected face, resistance movements began popping up, and one of these is called the Reunion Movement. They're a violent, revolutionary organization that seeks to overthrow the countries that oppress the infected and create their own country. They're the story's main antagonists, and we fight them as the pharmaceutical company, Rhodes Island, which is trying to find a cure for the infection, but works with both infected people and the governments that repress them to this end. Reunion, on the other hand, are not trying to cure the infection, which I guess is really interesting. Why wouldn't an organization made to help the infected want to cure them? The snippets of dialogue we get from Reunion members are really insightful into what makes this organization appealing. Most of its members have lost family. They've been ostracized and persecuted by their governments. They've suffered humiliation and abuse. A lot of Reunion is concerned with reclaiming the stigma of being infected and turning that into power. There's this brilliant moment in Arknights where Misha, a character who we try to save but who ends up joining Reunion, says shortly before her death, "To be an infected is to be a part of Reunion." And that one sentence sums it up so well. Reunion isn't just a movement, it's a reflection of the stigmatization and repression of the infected. So whether you're a member of Reunion or not, as long as you're infected, you're going to be inextricably a part of it. But there's also another aspect of Reunion that I'm interested in, and it's one that I've been alluding to for quite some time. Why do they even exist? Why are the infected so badly oppressed? This is a question that bugs a lot of people, and I think we can delve into it by learning about zombies and pandemic horror. The academic Johan Höglund has coined the term pandemic horror to describe how disease is often portrayed in cinema as a challenge to existing societal structures. Pandemics are magnified and made visible as people are transformed into the diseased other. The unraveling of society in the face of destructive pandemic is what allows for a conversation about how we today understand concepts of otherness. Höglund referred to pandemic horror in the context of zombie movies like Train to Busan, and the way middle-class protagonists are consumed by the disease and rise again as dirty, shambling analogs for the urban poor. We talked before about how stigma should be understood through how it reinforces power structures, and Höglund was concerned with how these zombie movies reflect the modern fear of economic instability and the breakdown of privilege in the face of an apocalyptic pandemic. The pandemic of Arknights is one that challenges the existing social order in a way similar to the zombie movies that Höglund references. The infected are deeply impoverished. Most of those who aren't outright placed in labor camps are herded into dirty, miserable slums. And that's really awful, isn't it? While writing this, my friend's criticism of Arknights just kept coming back to me. Why would the government persecute innocent people who just have a disease? It was really something that took a while for me to wrap my head around, but I think I have something of an answer for that now. I mentioned it briefly before, but oropathy is caused by a mineral called originium. This mineral has immense utility. It's a building material. It powers cities, and it can be weaponized too. Originium is a miracle material that the societies of Arknights are built upon. The infected, then, are an unwelcome reminder of the cost of a miracle. The infected are the poor members of society who are ordained to suffer so that the rest may prosper. There's a lot of parallels here with how we discuss resource extraction in real life, where the most hazardous mining is often done far away from the first world countries that benefit from it. Or with how vampires reflect that British fear of colonialism coming back to roost. I just mentioned how Höglund talked about zombies in pandemic horror, and zombies have a very interesting relationship with vampires. Historically, both of these undead categories have been used in discussions about capitalism, but with very different roles. Vampires have often appeared as analogies for the property-owning classes, the bourgeoisie. Heck, even Marx referenced vampires in Capital. Zombies, on the other hand, have at varying points stood in for slavery, consumerism, and the urban poor. And as much as I love talking about vampirism, in many ways, oropathy looks a lot more like a zombie disease. Yes, the members of Reunion are mostly sentient and don't actually eat human flesh, but in reading into the ideology of Reunion, I found that they act like zombies. And as much as I sympathize with Reunion's members, I've come to conclude that it's a doomed project. Zombies and Arknights infected are both examples of groups of the subaltern. Subaltern is a word that originally comes from the works of the writer Antonio Gramsci, and it essentially means those people and groups who are deprived of political and economic agency. The subaltern are not afforded universal rights, nor the protections a society might afford. If they are brutalized, there is no recourse for them. The zombie is deprived of agency by its very nature. But as for the infected, they have been stigmatized, made subaltern by hostile governments. Is there a way for the infected to recover some semblance of agency, to become people again and shake off their monstrosity? The sociologist Abdelmalek Sayad said of stigmatization, Black American sociology and colonial sociology teach that, as a general rule, one form of revolt, and undoubtedly the primary form of revolt, against stigmatization consists in reclaiming the stigma, which then becomes an emblem of resistance. So does Reunion represent this revolt against stigmatization? A reclamation of stigma that might herald a brighter future for the infected? It's a question that I've honestly been pondering while writing this script. And as much as I want to say yes, as I want to see a ray of hope in this dark story, the answer I've come to is no. Reunion isn't revolting against their stigma. Reunion embraces their stigma, yes, but in doing so, Reunion reflects that Goffman perspective of the stigmatized as abnormal. They can't help but view themselves as inferior. They embody that insecurity that Goffman saw in stigmatized individuals, the anxiety of a part of you making you inherently lesser in the eyes of another. And in order to revolt against this stigma, we need something more than that. The position of the infected as subaltern is not because oropathy makes them inherently inferior. There are social, political, and economic factors at play here. The dangers of resource extraction, governments that pursue expansion and war at the cost of their people, and even companies like Rhodes Island, the protagonists, privatizing treatment and profiting from the disease. And this is where I think Arknights' story goes wrong. Unlike zombie stories, Arknights is a world in which there is a real possibility for the disease to result in a positively changed society. Maybe the ways that oropathy unravels political and economic contradictions can be a chance for the world to reflect and heal in a way that leaves it stronger and more equitable. But that chance is squandered. Reunion is trying to escape from a repressive society that stigmatizes sick people as violent and monstrous, but their attempt to escape fails. Their resistance only exacerbates the conditions of their oppression, and in the end, the only thing they can do to fundamentally change their society is to completely destroy it. And that tells you something about the perspective of the writers. Instead of revolting against stigmatization, you're meant to just accept it. The only way out is to become normal, to be cured. And that's kind of bad, isn't it? There was something beautiful about Reunion embracing their infected identity, something heroic about wanting to build a society without stigma and oppression. Sure, I think that medically a cure is good, but what Reunion points to, perhaps accidentally, is what that possible cure really represents. The cure stands for the pursuit of normality, and the fear of the stranger, that Count Dracula, to know not is to care not for. The tragedy of Reunion is that they know that their society is broken, but they can't see why. They can only see infection as how it's been used against them, not as the socioeconomic status it represents. And that's, I think, the most important takeaway from the story of Reunion. And it can inform how we today fight stigma. The zombies, and perhaps Reunion, will inherit only decay and dust. But you and I, we aren't zombies, and we can learn. We tell monster stories because they reveal things about our society and culture. Pandemic horror reveals how our socially constructed identities can mystify the real causes of our suffering. Arknights doesn't exist in a vacuum. The story was informed by actual stigmas that people are facing day to day all around the world. Stigmas about race, gender, sexuality, and diseases. In the face of a world where xenophobia is on the rise and walls seem to be coming up around us, there has never been a more urgent time to face our stigmas and revolt against the power structures that cause them. There has never been a more urgent time to learn from the lessons of the monster stories we tell. And there has never been a better time to eat the rich.
Have you noticed vampires getting far too much love to the detriment of other groups of undead? Those elitist bastards skulking in their castles, sleeping in their velvet cushioned coffins, shunning daylight in the mansions like they had something to hide.
Hey, thanks for watching all the way through. This part isn't scripted, but I thought I'd give you a little treat at the end. It's 7:42 a.m. on Sunday right now, and I've just finished editing. I've lost a mouse in the process. It was a casualty of war, but I made it. And I hope that this video has brought you some enjoyment. I don't know if this is good or not. This has been a month-long project in terms of getting new ideas, throwing out old ideas. I originally wanted to make a video that connected Arknights to the book I Am Legend. It was quite a journey, and honestly, I'm glad it's over, but I'm also glad I did it. So let me know if you liked this video and what I could do better in the future. As always, if you have any thoughts on this, if you have your own input or your own expertise to add to the discussion, I'd be more than happy to see that, I guess? I don't know. I should go before I embarrass myself any further. But before I do go, next time, I'm gonna be releasing a video that is about VTubers again. I'm gonna be exploring what virtual actually means. So look forward to that at some point. Maybe in a month, maybe in 2 months. But I'll try to post more regularly. My classes are over, so I'm gonna have more time to dedicate my life to this insanity. So look forward to that. And other than that, if you have anything to add to the discussion, if you have any thoughts on this video, leave them in the comments, and I'll be happy because that will give me that affirmation that I so dearly desire. And other than that, I guess have a wonderful day. See ya.